Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Kristen Farrington, and I'm delighted to be the moderator of today's webinar, Combating Religious Intolerance Through Dialogue. We are excited to be partnering with the Interfaith Council of Metropolitan Washington on this fourth annual Day of Unity. As the American religious landscape continues to change, religious minority communities have continued to experience religious violence and discrimination. Even though religious freedom is a constitutional right, many religious minorities do not experience that freedom in their day-to-day lives. Our guests today will share their own perspectives on why we continue to see religious intolerance in America and how through dialogue and education, we can promote an understanding of our First Amendment freedoms and continue to advocate for our rights and the rights of others. Before I introduce our panelists, I just want to say that we are incredibly grateful to the Templeton Religion Trust for their generous support in helping to make this webinar possible. And so we're so fortunate today to have three amazing panelists who are really going to help us understand the complexity of these issues and the nuances, and really help us begin to see our way through to some possible solutions, both through dialogue and through education. So Trey Daniel is here with us today. He's the education manager of the Georgia 3 R's Project. Sophia Jetpuri is here with us today as well, and she's an educator at Al-Falah Academy. And Richard Foltin is also here with us today, and he's a fellow for religious freedom from the Freedom Forum. So we're thrilled to have all three of you guests with us today to help us really dig in to this issue, which really continues to plague our country in so many very painful ways. So I've invited each panelist to really reflect on their own experiences, really what they've seen in this past year, what they're hearing from those friends and colleagues within their own networks, and to talk about what their current concerns are around religious freedom and the continued intolerance that they see. And so each of them are going to take about 3 or so minutes in an opening statement, just to help us to kind of understand the context from their perspectives. And then we'll invite them to engage in dialogue about ways that we can really move forward as a country. And so I want to welcome Trey to go ahead and kick us off. Thank you so much, Trey, for being here today.
Thank you, Ms. Kristen. My name is Trey Daniel. I actually serve in the capacity right now for the Georgia 3 R's as an education manager. With that, I also wear another hat as a servant leader. I currently serve as the youth pastor, youth and young adult pastor in a local church in Atlanta, Georgia. So I wanted to give you that context so you guys can really see, of course, where I am coming from as it relates to some of the questions, the probing questions that Kristen has presented to us as panelists. So first and foremost, what I have seen in the past few years from my religious and faith tradition community as it relates to religious intolerance, violence, and discrimination is, of course, the way in which the African-American church, the Black church, has been subjected to racism, subjected to violence, more so from a political standpoint than anything. We all know, or we're all familiar with the Charleston shooting that recently, well, not recently, but has happened within the last 10 years. Many of us are also knowledgeable about recently, there was a Black Lives Matter, I guess, banner out front of a church that was degraded and ripped up and stepped on and just completely destroyed outside of a local Black church in the Washington, D.C. area. I believe it was Metropolitan AME, who was pastored by William Lamar. I say all of that to say have been numerous attacks on the Black church from its pastors. We even look at the political standpoint of Raphael Warnock and him being the first African-American senator, but yet him endorsing another pastor, and that being used as fuel from a political campaign to say that Raphael Warnock does not love America, and just so many other things. But I say all that to say that recently there has been attacks, mainly because of the way in which the political sphere has now intersected with religion, but more importantly, how the African-American community has kind of come alongside those who are going into office for those political changes to kind of help our country move forward in a place in which we see that not only the church has been a vehicle of change, think about the civil rights movement, but now we're seeing how the church is now actively participating in that change as well, not just being on the margins and not just being the ones who are protesting, but we're also the ones who are in holding some of these political offices as well. And as I end, I want to talk about where do I see the religious freedom, my concern, around religious freedom. And that is, my concern is that as we are talking about religious freedom, if we don't highlight the disparities that are happening within our own faith communities, then us as a nation won't be able to grow and move forward as it relates to religious freedom. Not only me being someone who was predominantly in the tradition of America, if you will, as Protestant, but for other faith communities as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Trey. And you brought up some really important issues that I'm hoping we're going to be able to dive in a little bit deeper to. So now I want to go ahead and invite Sophia. Sophia, be curious to see if you are seeing some of the same things in different contexts in your own experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. So I am an educator at Al-Falah Academy, which is a private pre-K 3 to 12 school here in Georgia. And I'm also a speaker with the Islamic Speakers Bureau. And we go around the state, basically trying to build bridges and get rid of some of those ignorance, that is prevalent in the community when people don't have the dialogue that we're trying to establish. Trying to speak to what Trey was referencing a little bit, we are seeing the political atmosphere is really changing from where it was, I would say 10 years ago. And that has shifted, especially in the past year or two, we have Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib, and, they're two of the women in Congress who are actually Muslim representatives. And we're seeing that, with their influence, having them there, that conversation is now coming, because prior to this, it was attacks on mosques, attacks at schools. At our own school, within the past 2 years, we've actually hired a security guard and 24/7 security, along with relationships with the police department to make sure they're constantly doing rotations. We're seeing students who are scared to identify themselves as Muslim because of fear of being targeted. And then we're seeing counterparts who have the same culture as like Pakistani or Indian culture, or people who, are being targeted because they have that Islamic look to them. So we're hoping, with the change of the political atmosphere a little bit and having more representation, that it's going in a more positive direction. And now that dialogue is starting to really create some change. But yeah, I'm going to stop from there and we'll keep discussing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sophia, for that great opening. And so, Richard, from your perspective, what are you seeing? What are you hearing? What has your experience been in this past year?
Well, thanks so much for watching. I'm really so honored to be here with these other two panelists and to have a chance to see you, Kristen. So first, let me just, by way of introduction, say, as you noted, Chris, and I am currently a religious freedom fellow with the Freedom Forum. For many years before that, I was with the American Jewish Committee, most recently the Director of National Legislative Affairs. And the focus of my work was on domestic policy issues, including religious liberty. And that work necessarily entailed building partnerships with other religious and ethnic groups. As a child of Holocaust survivors, I'm absolutely aware of how important it is both to vigilantly protect our precious liberties and also to build relationships with an understanding between communities. So in terms of what we're seeing now, a recent ADL survey says that 63% of American Jews say that they have experienced anti-Semitism over the past 5 years. And that's up from 53% the prior year, which is itself an increase. So we're seeing this greater trend of American Jews to say we have been victims of anti-Semitism, and the number of incidents that are reported by the ADL was sort of steady from 2020 to 2019, but the very high numbers. 2024 reported anti-Semitic incidents in the course of 2020. And there's also, of course, the FBI report, which shows that when you look at reports of hate crimes based on the perceived religion of the victim, and this is a first place nobody should want, more than half of those reported hate crimes are directed at Jews and Jewish institutions. Now, to be sure, the rate of increase is much greater in the Muslim community, and that's awful. In terms of absolute numbers, Jews remain the primary target. So there's good reason for there to be a lot of unease in our community. We, of course, had those awful attacks just recently, not last year, in Poway and in Pittsburgh. And so, we happily haven't seen that kind of thing happen, but nevertheless, there remain a great number of incidents in which Jews are targeted either through harassment or through violence or through what's now a new thing, Zoom bombing and internet, using the internet as a basis for harassing people who are Jewish. There's no question that the greatest danger to the Jewish community comes from the right wing. In terms of those attacks that I just mentioned, in which many people were killed, but also in many other attacks and other kinds of harassment, much of it comes from the far right. We know that QAnon and others of that ilk buy into many different kinds of anti-Semitic conspiracies about the state of Israel and its role in the world. But unfortunately, we're seeing it from other parts of the political spectrum as well. There certainly is anti-Semitism of the left, which sometimes tries to disguise its intrinsic anti-Semitism as anti-Zionism, but in which is involved, which invokes tropes that have been used against Jews for centuries, but now targets the state of Israel, and in doing so, then targets Jews here in the United States and identifies them with what they see as this vile presence in the world. So, and that comes from the left, that comes unfortunately from some parts of the Islamic community, although by no means all parts. But again, all of this is always about fringe actors. It's not about what people in the mainstream are doing, but that's a reality. That's a reality as well. Just in the last week, we've seen reports of synagogues that were vandalized in Riverdale, New York. Rocks through the windows. Happily, we hear that the perpetrator has been arrested. We don't really know much about his motivation, but it really doesn't matter. It's an act of hate, and it's an act that terrorizes and makes the Jewish community vulnerable. And similarly, a university in California has just in the last week voted to deny student funding. Student council there has voted to deny student funding to any organization that's seen as somehow implicated in the occupation in the West Bank in Israel. And if you read that what they voted for, that means in effect that Chabad and Hillel, as Jewish organizations, are not going to be eligible to receive funding any longer. So this making Jews into outsiders and ostracizing them, and making Jewish students on campus feel vulnerable and attacked is something else that we need to be concerned about. And both of those things just took place in the last week. So with that, I'm going to stop and we'll continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Richard. I mean, it's just so just depressing to be able to hear, you know, just event after event after event of hate.
I cannot hear you, Kristen. So.
Can you hear me now? It's just horrendous to hear about, you know, event after event after event that we're hearing of discrimination, of hate crimes and violence towards religious minorities. I'm curious from your perspective, you know, we're just coming through and beginning to see the end, hopefully, of the coronavirus and this pandemic. And I wonder if you think that it has, these incidents have gotten worse during the pandemic, or if you think that, as many of you mentioned, I mean, this has been going on for years and years, this trajectory has just kind of been continuing as it usually has. So how much do you think this past year and the pandemic has really, I guess, really influenced people and kind of intensified their fear and their need to scapegoat during this past year? I'm just curious on your thoughts or what people in your networks are saying about this. Any thoughts from any of you?
Well, one thing that we noticed, there was a research study that was done by the ISPU. And one thing that they noticed the stark differences from basically, you know, 2019 to 2020 was when they looked at the violence against the Muslim Chinese population. And they noticed a stark increase in that alongside the differences that they saw in the way people were reacting to the Uyghur human genocide issue, what's going on over there in that region. There are Muslims that are being put in concentration camps and body parts being taken away, and you know, they're used as slaves in that region right now. And in 2019, there was a lot of momentum. We were seeing that globally, you know, those issues were being come to light. And as soon as the pandemic hit, it just kind of got all silent. And what the ISPU were saying was that, you know, there was that little bit of not only the cultural discrimination there, but that was brought into with the religious discrimination as well. And it really affected the way that people decided to handle and move forward with that situation. And at the moment, there is nothing that is being done on a global stage to help those people that are out there. And we felt that the pandemic really made a difference in that.
Yeah, and I'll second those sentiments that the pandemic really just heightened what was already going on, amplified it, putting it on, you know, the mainstream stage. When we're even thinking about police brutality, right? Of course, this is something that has been going on in the African-American community. There has been tension with law enforcement, but with the pandemic, you know, with there not necessarily being I guess a way in which news can be funneled in other directions. We see a rise, we see a heightened rise of, you know, law enforcement crimes on citizens, predominantly African-American citizens. And I say that from one who is African-American, but also from someone who's representing the church as well, not being able to have funerals, you know, for those people who are accosted or who are dealing with the virus as well. So I would say the pandemic really affect so much that was going on as it relates to the church, not just the church globally, but more specifically for the African-American church.
Yeah. I would say, you know, what happens is these incidents of bigotry and hate move elsewhere as a result of the pandemic. So there are fewer anti-Semitic incidents on at schools, colleges, and universities? Well, because they're closed, they're on lockdown. And in cities also, to some extent, and there was a period of some dreadful attacks against Jews in Brooklyn. That seems to be somewhat less, although it's still happening. But instead, we see online, as I mentioned earlier, you see anti-Semitic harassment taking place, expression of anti-Semitic theories taking place, theories of the right wing about there continuing to be claiming that there's an anti-Semitic cabal to take over the world and to engineer replacement of white Americans with people coming in from other countries. All of that stuff finds greater and greater expression on the internet and in what's coming from the right wing. So I think we continue to, as I said earlier, the number of incidents that are counted as anti-Jewish incidents is pretty much the same as it was the prior year, but it's taking place in different venues and different formats than it did previously. And the numbers that are taking place is just way too high, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, as an educator, you know, when I tried thinking about it in a very anthropological kind of way, we had people who already had very basic sentiments that have been planted, you know, those seeds that were all there. And now they're sitting in an environment with, they can't leave. You know, they're either in lockdown, at home with their families, and those sentiments are being kind of really solidified at that point. They're not having the interaction with their peers at school or with individuals in their workplace to where they're able to get outside of whatever discrimination is being, you know, shifted into their brains. And now it's going on social media because that's their outlet. And it's just perpetuating on it, you know, in larger amount. Like Richard had said, you know, with the Islamic community, a lot of the research that we saw, another infographic that had came out in an American Muslim poll through the ISPU showed that about 60% of Muslims and about 58% of Jews were likely to report religious discrimination. And that was in comparison to only about 26% of Catholics, 43% of white evangelicals, and maybe 33% of general public. And what we noticed, you know, when we looked at those demographics, you know, I'm thinking in an anthropological kind of way, is that you had those minorities and those religious, you know, those are the ones that were really reporting those types of discrimination versus that majority of people who all looked a little bit different.
That's super helpful, all of you, to really try and figure out, you know, what has been going on and how the pandemic has really impacted this. And Sophia, you know, you and Richard and actually Trey all talked about kind of the root. It's been happening for a long time, right? And so this is nothing new. It's just been intensified. And, you know, I think during the pandemic, you know, being kind of caught in our own echo chambers and not, you know, really being able to hear lots of different perspectives and, you know, critical thinking and everything heightened by fear. As an educator, I'm always interested in the seeds of this hate. And we could have many, many webinars and discussions on that, but I think it's important to name it. So where, you know, we talk about, you know, the alt-far right and, you know, these seeds of discrimination and hate that we continue to see spewed and highly politicized now. So where is that coming from when you talk about it as educators, as religious leaders? Where do you talk about this coming from, stemming? Because I think we need to kind of name that before we can kind of say, how can dialogue and education help to really get at that root? So where do you see that root is, and how do you talk about it as educators and religious leaders in your communities?
I would say white supremacy. Just blatantly placing a name on it, white supremacy, which is the perpetuation of a system, you know, over the courses of generations of years that has, oops, did I lose you all? I'm sorry.
We can hear you just fine.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, that a system that has, you know, over years just perpetuated this stigma or this understanding of superiority over, you know, a certain class, a certain race, a certain ethnic group. But some of the things that I do for my work here, even at the Georgia 3Rs Project, is really try to talk about ways in which we can live in a more pluralistic society talk about ways in which interfaith, being in interfaith organizations or coming alongside interfaith organizations who are already doing this work of talking against differences, talking against different faith traditions, kind of help us move forward as it relates to, people, as a country, really trying to just move the needle forward as a society. Some of the things that, the IFC are doing is having conversations like this, right? Some of the things that we're doing from a Georgia 3Rs or Religious Freedom Forum perspective is coming into schools and having conversations with educators, with districts, to really talk about how children at their most, infancy stage have the ability to really change the focus of the nation, because they are the ones who are the next leaders. They are the ones who are the next generation that will be able to put an end to this. It's kind of hard, as adults to really change our minds, change our perspectives. But these young people are so impressionable. If we only would just reach them and get to them as it relates to how they see the world, how they see their friends that they grow up with, how they see their neighbors in the same area of them, in the same areas that they may worship. If we can only get to them and just talk to them about some of these things, that will kind of help us move forward in a later generation. Yes, it may be incremental growth, but in all, it's growth nonetheless.
Thank you, Trey. Richard or Sophia?
Yeah, so I want to pick up on and agree with what Trey is saying. Another aspect of white supremacy is, of course, the notion of America as a Christian nation, which is woven with that, and which perceives Jews and Muslims, members of other faiths, as not wholly American, not true Americans in the sense that these folks believe in, and therefore makes those communities into targets as well of their attacks. There's also many aspects of this idea of Christian supersessionism, Jews as Christ killers. All of that is unfortunately part of the history, along with the many good works to which people in the Christian world. I don't want for a moment to suggest there haven't been incredible works that are being done right now in the Christian world, but there's that history, and it underlies those folks on the right believe, and therefore in part leads to their buying into these conspiratorial theories about Jews and about the nature of Jews in a society. Similarly, there's been a troubling trend in some places now to talk about Jews as somehow being privileged and part of and supporters of white supremacy in some way. And of course, our community was the most tragic victim of the ultimate kind of white supremacy, which is of course Nazism, which led to the destruction of millions of Jews in Europe, including members of my own family. And I think that takes place in part, and that's why I want to absolutely acknowledge that as a person who presents as white, I have a benefit of certain privileges in this country that we will understand. Nevertheless, the idea of Jews is somehow uniquely identified as part of the white supremacist cabal, as it were, really looks away from that history. And I think it takes place in part because the debate over Israel and Palestine has become so virulent. And it's virulent in a way that both feeds anti-Semitism, but also the demonization of Israel grows out of anti-Semitism, I have to say. So you take all of that together, you have a situation where we as a community are under assault from both the far left and the far right, and which leads to the sense of unease and insecurity that many Jews are feeling today. Is because we do see Jews feeling many cases as if they're under assault from both of the ends of the political spectrum.
And Sophia, do you want to chime in as well?
I'm thinking how proud I am of you, Richard, that it's not only about bringing it out on the table, but taking that accountability on yourself as well, and understanding that, yes, you are having those privileges, and, understanding where you are in terms of you as the way you present and what you really believe in and what your community really stands for. And that is where this dialogue is very important and crucial. You know, when I look at myself and our community, we have me as a woman, and then on top of that, as a Muslim woman, and then my friends who are Black, Muslim, and women. And it's, you know, it's that hill that they climb. And like Trey said, it's going to be an incremental change, you know, and when we look at what's causing this, outside of saying only white supremacy, there's also that fear. And, you know, white supremacy is a huge part of it. But I think when there isn't dialogue and people are in their houses in their own little bubbles, you're going to have that ignorance, and they don't have an outside perspective. They have no one telling them otherwise. And it's just going to continually perpetuate until dialogue is brought up.
Thank you so much. It's so helpful. And I'm really grateful for all of you just being really honest and putting this all on the table. And there is a lot here to dive into. And I would love to talk more about white supremacy because I know it certainly isn't just the far right or the far left. It's hard to live in this country without being steeped in it. Every person, our history, and really need to you know, dig into it and understand it and understand our privilege. If we are white, and to understand, and if we are Christian, and really to understand what that means, and the consequences of our complicity in systems. I want to just turn to make sure that we really get to religious freedom, one of our basic freedoms. And I was horrified when I first started working for the Freedom Forum a number of years ago, and certainly as I've continued on and as an educator, how few people really understand religious freedom, or even, you know that that's one of our First Amendment rights. And yet I think it's so important to talk about this, and we need to know it. And our children need to understand what it is. So how have you been able to kind of connect the dots within your communities, or people that you're talking with outside your communities? You know, that when we're seeing the rise of religious intolerance, we have to connect this to religious freedom. How have you talked about that? Where have you seen pushback? You know, I guess, what kind of successes have you seen in having these conversations and helping people to truly understand that this is a freedom that we all have to continue to fight for? We can't just assume that we have it, and we all need to know about it and understand it. So why don't we start with you, Richard?
Sure. So, first of all, I wouldn't even use the term religious tolerance. I think pluralism is a much better word, because in our society, we shouldn't just be tolerant of religions. We should be respectful and regard people of diverse faiths and of diverse backgrounds as equals. Well, we're all equals in this society. But I think that the absence of that kind of respect is a prescription for driving people into metaphorical ghettos. You know, that there's a danger for people to act on their intolerant perspectives through expressions and even through violence. And, you know, it's no surprise, everybody understands that the American Jewish community largely is politically liberal. I'm very much in that mode. And so there's been a dynamic recently in which there's a push, which is entirely appropriate, to end discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, to move towards, doing the right thing by people who have been victims of discrimination for many years. And that runs afoul of some religious communities. And, you know, one can argue about what the right balance is to draw in terms of anti-discrimination protections versus what kind of religious accommodation there ought to be. But however that takes place, it's very important not to turn people who have an adverse point of view on this into pariahs, into questioning the legitimacy of their religious beliefs, as opposed to saying, you may believe this, but society can only accommodate you so far. Those are two very different things. And I've had conversations with folks, both within and without the Jewish community, who not only have a certain picture of that, which is that they will provide very little of any accommodation to those beliefs, but who basically will say to me, oh, we want to treat them like pariahs. They should be pariahs. And this is really contrary to the notion of a religiously pluralistic society in which we learn how to live together despite our deepest differences, and differences on very fundamental concerns. And it's not to say that there aren't folks out there with bad motives, and sometimes we have to deal with that. But by and large, the default position ought to be really what Justice Kennedy said, which was almost his last opinion in the Supreme Court in the has to be spatial case, that we have to, that we can deal with these issues and respond to discrimination, but in a way that continues to respect people with diverse religious points of view. So, you know, I think that that's something that we have to have greater respect for that idea that religious freedom is not just religious freedom for the folks that you agree with, as with all of our freedoms. It means that you have to be open to dialogue and to encounters with people who disagree with you on very fundamental things. And that doesn't mean you give up your policy, what you think is the right policy, but it does mean that you learn to treat people with respect, whatever their religious perspective.
And Trey, I know that you're working a lot right within public schools and talking about religious freedom and the importance of it. What's your experience been? Do students understand it? Is this part of the education that they're receiving anyway? You know, I'd love to hear, you know, your perspective on this.
Yeah, so a lot of the times, no, they do not understand it. Simply just the understanding that, you know, religion or religious freedom is your right to practice, to establish. Most students, and I would even say most districts and superintendents are quite frankly scared, kind of similar to, as you mentioned, Kristen, they're scared because they don't want to say the wrong thing. You know, they don't want to do the wrong thing. They don't want to infringe on anyone's right and have to get into, you know, the whole legal situation about religious freedom in the First Amendment. However, our job is to really come in and to teach and to educate on religious freedom in the First Amendment from a purely academic perspective, not promoting one religion or the other, not talking about devotional practices of any specific religion at all, but purely saying that our right as Americans is to practice or to establish any religion that we deem fit. And that goes across the board. As Richard kind of mentioned, it's not more so religious intolerance, but it is us moving towards a more pluralistic society, and just understanding that everyone has this right, and that we shouldn't be, you know, the gatekeepers or as into who's right or who's wrong, but specifically just speaking to the opportunity of giving everyone the opportunity or the right. And also from the African American community, it's quite unique to have this conversation because a lot of the times we find ourselves on the margins, we find ourselves in the minority. But if we're speaking about Christianity, you know, whether it's Baptist denomination or whether it's United Methodist denomination, we in Atlanta, you'll find yourself now in the majority. So it's quite unique, you know, to have this conversation to a people who normally in every facet of life are on the defense, but now we're putting them on the offense as we're talking about religious freedom. And the way I really try to get across to them is just the simple fact that since we are people who had been stripped of things, have been discriminated against, have been told that we can't do certain things, let's keep that in the forefront of our mind as it relates to other religions and other perspectives as well, because not too long ago or not very far, we might find ourselves in those same instances as well.
Thank you, Trey. And Sophia, I mean, you've talked about the importance of dialogue. I would love to hear from your perspective, and you are speaking, you're an educator, but you also spend a great deal of your time speaking with groups and engaging with them in dialogue. So how have you found that this has helped to kind of get to the root, as we're talking about, of this incredible intolerance or just this lack of understanding or simply ignorance about other religious traditions?
My work seems very similar to what you're doing as well, Trey. Going to see, corporations, going to police officers and different institutions and training, not, again, about the how to practice, but the very basics, what the religion is, to build that bridge and raise awareness. I'm actually noticing, because they are so scared, especially right now, I'm working very closely with Gwinnett County Public Schools. Because of that fear of saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing, they're actually more open to make a change or do something, because they don't want to be in the wrong either with the political atmosphere. They don't want to get flagged for, doing something that would inhibit someone's religious freedom. And schools have to make sure that they're able to accommodate someone's religion without, stepping and infringing on those rights. So right now, what I'm very actively working on is there's 2 projects. One, to make sure that there's equitable meals in our schools, not only just 2-3 vegetarian basic cheese pizza, PB&J, yogurt options, but halal and kosher meals, not only for Muslims, but also for our Jewish community, because there's ways to do it. And we were noticing that Gwinnett County is very open to that. And recently we heard from Cobb County, which was brilliant, because they want to get on board too, because they don't want to be the county that is infringing on anyone's rights. So they have the resources, they have the funding, and they're able to do it. It's more a matter of creating that dialogue and coming and say, hi, we are doing this, and I want to speak with you, and we're going to work on it. And they would not have reached out. They wouldn't have known that they were doing something wrong if no one initiated that dialogue to begin with. So a lot of it is taking that first step, pushing them past their comfort zone, what they're not, they don't, I guess, what they say is, if you don't know what you're doing, you don't think you're doing anything wrong, if no one points it out to you. When I think about what Trey said, our Atlanta community here is, very diverse, and you have a majority of actually African-American and Black community, to where you're not going to be as marginalized as if you're living somewhere else, possibly. I grew up in Dallas, Texas, and I was the only brown girl in my school for years and years. And I didn't notice at the beginning, this was me at 10 years old. I had no idea that I wasn't, I would say, white, or because I was treated with the same privileges as most of them, until it was a birthday party and a mom came and uninvited me from a party and said, we're so sorry, you can't come to my daughter's party because it's only people who are just like us. We think you won't belong. And at that point, it was like, oh, okay, I am not like you guys. And it hit me. And I can't even imagine that happening here in Atlanta, because we have such a diverse population here in Atlanta. And even then it still happens. So it's just interesting to see for me that, in those areas that are not as diverse, and you don't have those population demographics that really tend to push that dialogue, what are those people doing and how can they make a change? Here we're able to do it because we have 20% Muslim in Gwinnett County School. My kid's school is about 30% African-American and Black, and the whites are actually in the minority. So we're able to push for some change, versus a very basic dynamic. But what about the schools that are in Central Ohio or Kentucky, and the ones that don't have that diversity? That's what I want to hear from Richard and Trey. What can we do to help them with their dialogue and to help them with their religious intolerance out there?
Before you answer, Richard, I just want to invite people to please, if you have questions for our panelists, I certainly want Richard and Trey to respond to that, because that's a really important question, and that has to do with both education and dialogue, and how we can really kind of crack this nut, which we haven't been able to do, and we really, really need to figure it out. As religious leaders and educators and community leaders, because it's hurting our communities. So I really want to hear from our audience, though. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put any questions into the chat. We already have some questions here, but I'm sorry for interrupting, Richard. I just wanted to do that.
So I just want, first of all, that's terrific work that you're engaged in, Sophia. And it's the issue of religious accommodation, I think, is really crucial to the notion of promoting religious tolerance, because I think one of the things, and this is not true of folks on the extreme, we were talking about the extreme left before, but even in the center, there's a tendency people have to think that their norms are well neutral. whether it's, what days they observe as holy, or, diets, garb, all of these things. So if they have rules against, for instance, wearing something on your head in the military, or what's served as a meal, there's a tendency to see the norms of the community as that's what's neutral, and you're providing, and if you start accommodating, somehow you're not treating everybody equally. So we need to get beyond that and understand that our notion of what's neutral is culturally derived. It's derived from the particular society we're in, and if we're truly going to be a pluralistic society, we haven't gotten to what to do next, but part of what we have to do next is to educate young people, to educate people in general, that we have a society where people have different ways of living, and they're still full Americans, and they still should be able to have not a formal equality, but what I would call existential equality, that they're able to participate in the society fully, notwithstanding that they have practices and religions and even cultural norms that are not the same as everybody else. And so diet is one of the most crucial areas where this takes place, but so also, for many years I worked on something called the Workplace Religious Freedom Act, which was an effort to pass a law at the federal level that would do a better job in terms of requiring employers provide an accommodation, religious accommodation in the workplace. There's a lot of work to be done there as well. So.
Yeah, and I'll agree with what Richard is saying. First, it really requires them to really take assessment and really reflect on, are they literally being just? Are they discriminating any voices? Are they only speaking particularly to their own kind, if you will? And as Kristen said, that echo chamber, right? Are the same voices just bouncing around in this echo chamber, in this vacuum? Or are they really being true and intentional about diversity? Are they including other faith traditions? Are they including other ethnicities in their decision-making process, in their leadership roles and opportunities? So I really think first it starts with just reflection and just seeing, once you look at the table and once you see who's at the table, that should require you to make some changes to begin with. And then, of course, bringing in the experts, because no one wants to step on anyone's toes. No one wants to say the wrong thing, but then seeking out those experts who can come in and speak to religious freedom purely from an academic standpoint or from a legalistic standpoint that doesn't infringes on anyone's rights.
Thank you so much, Trey. We have a question here from Susan that I would love to invite everyone on the panel to go ahead and answer. So Susan asks, how can we build upon many years of positive interfaith and interethnic dialogue to respond to and to redirect the current situation that you have outlined? So thank you, Susan. And we have the years and years and years of really incredible interfaith work that has been done in communities across the nation. So how can we build on that?
Look, we first talk, because we shouldn't assume everybody in the audience. Susan may know about all the good work that's being done, but not sure everybody else does. So let me just say that dialogues, both in terms of broadly interfaith coalitions and then bilateral kinds of dialogues, really were a crucial part of the work I was doing when I was at HAC, whether it was with evangelical Christians, mainline Protestants, Muslims, Hindus. And more recently, I just want to describe two ongoing efforts that really that describe very important dialogue efforts. One is something called the Inter-Jewish Muslim Alliance, which brings together community representatives, leaders from both of those communities to talk about what can be done to combat anti-Semitism in the Muslim community and anti-Muslim animus in the Jewish community. And that puts on the table the most difficult question. Now, we don't do all of these in the light of day because to have a candid conversation, sometimes you have to speak to each other privately. But some of the very issues I alluded to earlier are topics of conversation between our communities. And I think it's been very productive. And so, and the other project I'll mention is something called the Dialogue on Faith and Race, which brings together a broad group of folks from different racial and religious backgrounds to talk about the role, both good and bad, that religion has played in race relations in our country and what we can do on a going forward basis. to do a better job. So I would look to those as models for things that we ought to be doing more broadly, that we're not done with dialogue yet, because for the very reasons some other panels have mentioned, these are tough conversations and people are afraid to say the wrong thing. And we see in the large society that sometimes people pay a high price for saying the wrong thing. So we need to find ways for people from different communities to be able to talk to each other about what's really troubling them, and to do so in a safe place that allows these conversations to be productive and lead to the next step, which I think, among other things, means doing a better job of educating young people and also people who are already out in society about the challenges we have in our history and our practices and what we can do to try to make it better.
Yeah, and I'll say,
Go ahead.
and I'll say from just a religious standpoint, calling on religious leaders to be that example, right? Being a religious leader, you have the opportunity, or you really have the freedom to bring in other people bringing other people to your congregation to speak. It doesn't necessarily have to be a faith message, but just opening or exposing your congregation to other faith traditions, right? Because as we know, as people, there are a lot more similarities that we have in common than we have differences. So I think starting there from a religious leader standpoint is something that we can call our leaders to do, and really kind of not force, but really kind of encourage our leaders to do, and then from an educational standpoint, as I mentioned before, whether you're on the PTA or whether you sit on the board, just take a census of, who's in those leadership positions as well, and really question and reflect, is this diverse enough? Are we speaking to everyone that's in our particular community? Do we have a voice represented for everyone in our particular community? And I think that right there can kind of help us move forward as it relates to this dialogue that we're having even today in other faith, interfaith conversations.
I want to build on what Trey and Richard have both spoken about, and Sophia too is dialogue is never a kind of a one and done. You really have to dig in, and the two examples that Richard gave, I know that they meet regularly, and it's a group that is committed to building relationships, because dialogue is really all about building relationships and really creating a place where you can begin to trust each other, to have those hard conversations and to really dig deep. And in my own school, we have been having really difficult conversations and creating space to do diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work. And it's been incredible, but our students have met every single week during the whole year. And we've needed that to build relationships, to really dig into the difficult conversations about racism, that is in our community and has been in our community. And so I encourage religious leaders and educators and anyone who is interested in this to find an opportunity to get connected with a group, but commit yourself to a long term, because I think that's where you see the transformation, when you are in a group and you're willing to really engage and, time after time, to really build that trust and get to the really deep understanding of the issues at hand. So thank you all so much. I know we're just about out of time, and I'm so grateful for all of the people who have attended today, and I'm so incredibly grateful for our panelists who have helped us to really understand the complexities of all the issues around this. I would love for you, just as we wrap up, to say, where do you see hope in all of this? Where do you see hope? I think that would be a good place for us to end today. So Sophia, can we start with you?
Yeah, I do feel like things are improving, or I'm just the eternal optimist. I think, when you shake a system up so much, it's got to change, right? So part of the pandemic did do that for a lot of people. It brought out the worst, and it brought a lot of things to light. And that's when real change happens sometimes, when you have those hard conversations and all those ugly things come out. you break a system apart and then it can slowly be built back up in the way that works for everyone. And, I hope that my current efforts with the county results in meals that are equitable for all. We're also hoping to make Eid holiday and Yom Kippur and all of these other holidays to make them considered holidays, so that, for example, my own kids don't miss milestones and field day and picture day and all of these amazing events because their religion isn't considered, the norm for the way that the systems were wrote. So I have hopes that, we make them stronger so that they'll work for everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sophia. And Trey?
Yes, I think where do I see hope is even looking at what happened with the AAPI, and that's the Asian American Pacific Islander community, and what the recent atrocities has happened with them. It gives us an opportunity as those who may be on the margins, those who may be discriminated against, to really to pull together and see that, we're not fighting this alone, but we're fighting this together. So it will increase allyship amongst others. It would also give us an opportunity to really come together and see ways in which we can combat some of these disparities together and move forward as a people, as a nation, and just be a lot more diverse as it relates to leadership. Thank you for those who are in political office that are now given an opportunity to represent some of these communities. But that's the start. That's the start. So I'm grateful for that. And I think, as more people become educated, religious intolerance and religious freedom will be able to be on the forefront of what's going on in our nation.
Thank you so much, Trey. And Richard, final words?
So it's maybe a cliche, but I want to invoke Charles Dickens. It is the best of times, it is the worst of times. We have, this greater expressionism and people living in their bubbles, and we see all of that bubbling up on the internet. We've seen awful attacks on various of our communities. But at the same time, at least in response to the worst of those attacks, we've seen it coming together. We've seen, I went to the Pittsburgh synagogue in the days after that horrible attack. And outside of that synagogue, there was gathered a group of people, of course, people from the Jewish community, but from every other community you could imagine, there to express sorrow and solidarity with those who have been victimized. So my hope, and I think we can move in that direction, is that we will each come better to understand, not only when we've got something that's so obviously horrible, but when one of our communities feels attacked and victimized in ways that people from other communities don't necessarily see, that they will learn to understand through the eyes of that victimized community what is going on. As is going on now with the Asian American community, but I think people are beginning to better understand why that community feels so part of it and why they need our support. I think I'm hopeful because we live in hope that the better sides of our natures will come forth and that we will learn to understand each other better and be better allies for each other as we wrestle with the darker forces in our society.
I want to thank all of you so much for your words of wisdom today. And I have learned a great deal from you. I am inspired by you and the work that you're doing. I'm so incredibly grateful for those who attended today. And I know that this webinar will be recorded, and so other people will be able to join as well. So we leave with hope, but also I think what you have done is to really also challenge us. There's a great deal of work that needs to be done. And I think every single American needs to dig down deep and to find ways to get involved in this. We can't just allow a few to carry the burden of this. We each have a responsibility for really digging in and making the changes that we want to see in our society, and really to transform our society to be able to live in to the vision that we have of equity and justice for all. So thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Trey. Thank you, Richard, again, for being with us today. And thank you for all of our attendees. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you again soon. Take care. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.